We are in Hollywood, Florida for the occasion of the grand opening of the Church of Perpetual Life. Inspired by the concepts of Prophet Nikolai Fedorovich Fedorov, the Creator's plan is for mankind to develop technologies that will facilitate the transformation of life into an environment of perpetual duration. Its members and friends would like an institution that leads people to bond and feel that they are part of an important group of efforts. And that's exactly what the Church of Perpetual Life hopes to achieve, and of course to defeat aging and disease. This new church is here to celebrate life, and we will learn more following these messages.
Health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It's a basic human right, essential for a long and happy life, and something we all strive for.
You know, there's an aspect of humanity that is so self-evident that it does not require an explanation. This self-evident aspect of humanity does not need to be justified, and it certainly does not require any kind of societal vindication. No one can rationally argue that illness is preferable to good health. No one can rationally argue that involuntary death is preferable to vibrant life. An increasing number of people are refusing to accept the concept of involuntary death. These individuals are rebelling against the societal and scientific inertia that is robbing us of our youth, our health, and our very existence. Now, human beings, unfortunately, have a flaw. This flaw enables them to accept the most abhorrent traditions. Abhorrent traditions such as degenerative disease, aging, and death as something that's inevitable and therefore necessary, merely because that's the way it's always happened. Now, the founders of the Church of Perpetual Life recognize that people erect psychological barriers against the acceptance of new ideas. Not only do people have difficulty understanding the societal value to a radical novel technology, but they conjure up all kinds of imaginary, cynical scenarios where they somehow think that a major breakthrough, a major technological advance will create a problem, simply because it's going to change the way things have always been. We like to use analogies to try to explain our position, to validate our position. And one easy analogy to talk about is how skeptics looked at train travel. The fear was if human beings traveled at a rate of speed that was too fast, they would suffocate. And as locomotives continued traveling faster and faster, and people walked out of those locomotives alive, still breathing, well, that whole theory was disproven, and it fell by the wayside. Now, we believe that in the future, people are going to look at the degenerative diseases that we suffer with today, the so-called inevitable aging process, the involuntary death. They're going to look at that as a relic, something that they're grateful that they don't have to contend with, because we, hopefully in this society, this generation, took some initial steps to stop it. The Church of Perpetual Life has been established to fill a modern-day gap. The church will unite like-minded individuals. We're going to teach scientific rationality and accelerate the Creator's plan for mankind to develop technologies that will facilitate the transformation of life into an environment of perpetual duration. A founding tenet of this church is that indefinitely extended, healthy human lifespans are not only desirable, and I'd hate to think that anyone would argue against that concept, that indefinitely extended, healthy human lifespans are not desirable. We see them as being utopia. But they're also attainable. Indefinitely extended human lifespans are attainable. And they're what the Creator intended for mankind to accomplish. Now, on the screen, you can see on each side of me there, you see a picture of a book. It's a rather rare book right now. It was written about a prophet named Nikolai Fedorov. The name of the book is What Was Man Created For? And according to the prophet Fedorov, man was created to achieve the common goal of humanity, which is to develop technologies that will result in universal salvation. Those books, by the way, are very hard to come by. If you go onto eBay, they cost about $3,000. We're hoping to obtain the publication rights, so we'll have them sitting in all the pews in your future visits here, and that everyone can have a copy of them. Because Fedorov truly was a prophet. And in his time in Russia, famine was a major concern. If the harvest did not yield enough food, people went hungry. People starved. And Fedorov didn't understand why mankind wasn't devoting more technology to figuring out how to more productively grow food. He said it was possible. And unfortunately, in his era, mankind was more involved in war, discord, sloth. He viewed it as sinful that mankind did not devote more energies to resolving the problems that were creating unnecessary death. So we're going to talk a little bit about Fedorov's doctrines during this presentation, and we're going to talk about some modern science, and we're going to see how these merge together. And I want to thank people, by the way, for showing up tonight. I know you had a lot of other activities you could have been engaged in. I mean, there are bowling alleys out there. There's movie theaters. You could have been sitting in front of your TV or in a loud nightclub, or maybe just glued to your computer screen. But what we're trying to do is bring people together to create a common cause so that we can develop and accelerate the technologies that we know inevitably will occur, but we'd like to see them occur in our generation. So what I'm going to do tonight is show you something that's never been displayed in public before. First time you're going to see something. We're going to flip right now to the second screen here. What you're looking at is a brain of a 45-year-old woman. She's alive, by the way. This is a SPECT scan. This measures metabolic activity. And what you're going to see in this brain is areas where there's very little metabolic activity occurring. You see these two little holes right here? Those are areas where there's very little blood circulation, very little cellular metabolic activity. This is the top of her brain. It should be all filled in, by the way, but what you see here is a cavern. This is areas where her brain is not functioning very well. And then we go to the base of her brain. It's even worse. We see these very large gaps in areas that should be filled with blood flow, that should be brewing with metabolic activity. Instead, they're empty. The structure's still there, by the way. There's just no metabolic activity to speak of. And right here at the base of her brain, this gulf here, this huge area should be filled up with healthy metabolic activity. It's empty. Now, this woman had a debilitating chronic fatigue syndrome. She was not able to function either in work or in play or anything else. She went to an innovative doctor, and at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you what happened after 2 months of an innovative therapy being initiated. We, by the way, are investigating this therapy as a way to potentially reverse the aging process systemically in human beings today. This is something that might be available very soon today for us to reverse large aspects of aging, not just in the brain, but in our vascular systems, our livers, our kidneys, and I'm going to explain that as we go through this presentation. We have to enlighten the public as to how far we have come from a technological standpoint over the last 100 years. Because people just don't remember how short lifespans used to be. In 1900, people lived to be about 47 years of age on average. Now that's a little misleading because the infant mortality rate was quite high back then, so that skewed the numbers downward a bit. But we've looked at a lot of documentation. We've studied a lot of history, and people, for the most part, if they made it into their 30s or 40s, they were very unhealthy. And some of the unhealthy aspects of their life that you might imagine is an ingrown toenail. Doctors didn't always know how to deal with that. So people simply walked around in pain. They did figure out how to do that around the year 1860, but around 1900 they still were trying to figure out what caused appendicitis. Some doctors knew if you went to the right doctor, he would remove the right organ. If you went to the wrong doctor, he wouldn't be able to effectively treat that disease, and you would die a horrifically painful, agonizing type of a situation in which fever and eventually peritonitis would kill you. But you look at today, we're living much longer. That's only over a period of 100 years. 1900, very low life expectancy. And there's a lot of young people in this group, so I can't say we all wouldn't be here, but a lot of us, on average, wouldn't be alive right now in 1900. And here we are thinking we expect to live a lot longer. And you look at women, they didn't live past the age of 50 for the most part. I mean, they were dying of all kinds of illnesses that today are treatable. And today, of course, most women do live beyond 50. They live beyond 50 in a reasonable state of health. We sometimes forget what killed people in the past. It wasn't the strokes and cancer and heart disease that plagues us today. It was microorganisms, bacteria, viruses that people weren't even sure in 1900 really existed. And yet that's what was killing the public. Diseases that we now have a treatment for. Those aren't killing the bulk of the population anymore. Those aren't concerns in modern society right now, and yet that's what was killing people just 100 years ago. We've since cured that. 1946 is when antibiotics were available on a mass scale, and yet antibiotics, the concept was discovered and published in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. He made a fortuitous discovery that a certain mold would kill bacteria without injuring healthy cells. And Fleming is credited, by the way, for that discovery. It was actually discovered somewhat before him, and it wasn't paid attention to. It was ignored. And can you imagine how many human beings were needlessly dying when an effective therapy already existed to cure them? And you think of the parents of the children who were dying right before their eyes, and yet in a published medical journal was information about a mold that when put into a human being could eradicate the bacteria. Well, the same situation occurs today. We have people needlessly dying of aging processes that are treatable, that are controllable, and in some cases reversible. And yet these individuals are needlessly dying right before our eyes, just like they were doing in the early 1900s from infectious diseases when effective therapies were already substantiated in peer-reviewed scientific publications. This little pie chart was created just to try to emphasize how long recorded human history goes back and what a little slither is represented over the last 113 years. And what has happened over the last 113 years is far more technological advance than happened in the entire spectrum of the previous period. You go to 8000 BC to 1899, and progress was relatively trivial. I mean, the mistakes that were made, the ignorance that existed before 1900 was ridiculous. And look at what we've accomplished in that little slither, that little red spot. That indicates where we are over the last 113 years. Now just imagine 100 years from now, when there's an even tinier slither, the accelerated technological progress that's going to result in the eradication of the degenerative diseases that we know today, the aging processes that we're suffering with, and these involuntary deaths that are so tragic. When we live, the period of time when we live dictates how long we will live. And if you realize when this country was founded, the founding fathers, by the way, pretty much all suffered from a number of medical conditions. There was a book published recently called Revolutionary Medicine, and it described all of the health ailments of our founding fathers. And we thought that the founding fathers were vibrant, energetic people, and they were, but they suffered. And they also didn't live very long. At least the average person in 1800, 36 years of age. And in the last 200 years, we've been able to double that. In a period where there wasn't always a lot of technological advancement occurring, we've been able to double that. So to me, that tells you a lot, that when you're around dictates how long you're going to live. And where you live, that has an effect as to how long you're going to live. In other countries, people are living somewhat longer than they are in the United States. And what we're going to try to teach here at this church are what other people are doing in other countries or just other parts of this country that we're not aware of, that's enabling them to live longer. So we see in the United States, people are living to be around 79 years of age, which is a big improvement, but some other countries, they're living longer. They're obviously doing something different, because when these people move to the United States, they die at the average age of people in our country. So it's not their genetic predisposition that's giving them that longevity. It's where they live and their culture, their health habits. But to go at the other end of the spectrum, if we decided to move somewhere else and adopt the standards of these other countries, we go back to where we were in 1900. These are primarily countries in Africa, and these people don't live very long at all. This would be totally unacceptable to us today, and yet this is what people in these other countries are suffering through. So where we live and when we live, that really determines how long we're going to live. I like to use analogies wherever I can, and they're plentiful, the analogies. But smallpox is a really good analogy to emphasize what's going to happen over the next several decades, over the next several hundred years. But in the 20th century, that was last century we're talking about, 300 million people died of smallpox worldwide. Now, that wasn't occurring so much in the United States or civilized countries, but throughout the world, 300 million. That's the entire population of the United States. They died of smallpox when there was already a way to prevent that disease from occurring. Historically, smallpox infected so many people, it was hard to imagine it would ever go away. I mean, it was always there. The survivors had pock marks on their face, they were blinded by it, and many of them died. So it was hard to say in the year 1600 in Europe, let's say, that someday smallpox won't even be a factor. People would say, well, we don't even know what causes it. How are you going to get rid of something? We don't even know what causes it. We have no idea how to treat it. What was interesting, though, is everyone knows about Edward Jenner, I hope. Around 1796, he developed a cowpox vaccine that made people immune to smallpox. But before Jenner discovered that, in Asia, they were using pus from smallpox lesions and blowing that pus up their nose. Now, that killed some of them from smallpox. Some of them died. But for about 97% of them, it gave them immunity against smallpox for life. Now, this was being done in Asia while the Europeans were dying. Entire cities virtually wiped out with smallpox epidemics. And in Asia, they weren't suffering this because they had discovered something. But that information wasn't translated. It wasn't transferred from Asia to Europe. It got stuck in Asia. And I fear a lot of good information that exists right here and now. Right here and now, people don't know about it. And they're unnecessarily dying. It took 700 years for the Europeans to discover what the Asians were doing to prevent smallpox. All of that time, all of those deaths, we're probably talking about hundreds of millions of deaths at that point. The population of the world, of course, was smaller back then, but it was wiping out so many people. Smallpox, by the way, is one of the reasons why the Europeans were able to conquer the Western Hemisphere. They brought with them the diseases in which the Indians and the native populations had no immunity to, and this wiped out the native populations. So 1796, Edward Jenner discovers a smallpox vaccine. Harsh criticism was leveled against him for doing it. They thought what he was doing was immoral. Some people had some religious objections to it, but he pushed forward. By 1840, the British were making smallpox vaccinations available to everybody. So here in Britain, people were no longer dying of smallpox, whereas throughout most of the rest of the world, including the U.S., people were dying. And it was just an absolutely nasty disease. Again, this analogy. Here you had vaccines available, but they weren't being used. But we have an even better argument about defeating aging and defeating permanent death. And I say that because they were able to figure out how to eradicate smallpox without knowing what caused it. No one thought about viruses. No one thought about microorganisms causing disease back then. And yet they figured out a way to keep human beings from dying from it. We know so much more now about aging, disease, why people involuntarily die. We know so much more today than what they knew back then, and yet they achieved the eradication of one of the most prevalent causes of death. We're going to achieve that because we know a lot about what's going on with aging, and a lot of people in this room know a lot about aging, and they're doing a lot of good things about it right now. So just as smallpox was eradicated in Europe, we're going to eradicate aging today. Aging affects us all. I mean, no one gets a free pass when it comes to growing old and suffering degenerative diseases. And smallpox, of course, that affected everyone, rich, poor, no matter who you were vulnerable. And some of the more elite individuals in Europe suffered the aspects of smallpox. And if you survived it, it was nasty. When you see movies of people in the past, they're not really portraying these people accurately, because most of them had pockmarks on their face because they were survivors of this horrible disease. And the blindness, the disabilities, it was a horrible illness. But the fact is, it went away. And people in the past couldn't have conceived of that going away, and yet it did. So we just look at that as just a natural progression of science. And we need to accelerate that science, and we're going to achieve that through the works of this church. So just as aging spares no one today, smallpox affected everybody. In a not-too-distant future, aging will be a relic of the past. We'll learn how to control it, slow it, and reverse it. It's going to happen. It's a matter of, are we going to do it in our lifetime? Or are we going to wait for some future generation to do it? So someone will be up on a podium like I am tonight, talking about how horrible the aging process was to people, and the fact that it doesn't exist anymore. So getting back to the prophet Nikolai Fedorov, he felt that God had not created mortals, that death was the penalty inflicted by our sins of sloth, our sins of discord. So Fedorov laid out some doctrines, and we've summarized these here, and they're translated from Russian, so they're stated a little bit differently than what you might see them stated if they were written by someone fluent in English. But his first doctrine, I think, is a given. Man is an active creature and will always act. I don't think anyone would disagree with that for the most part. Number two, if man does not know what to do, he will do what he should not do. And that's what's happening today. Man is acting. He's always going to act. But he's doing what he should not do when it comes to advancing technologies that will result in the universal salvation of all mankind. Now, number three, man will cease doing what he should not do only when he knows what to do. And this is a mission of our church. We are here to educate, to facilitate the development of technologies that will result in universal salvation. It has to be taught. It's not something we're just born to know. It has to be taught. Man will give his energies to a cause when he regards it as duty. And for me personally, ever since I can remember, I've always felt an obligation to investigate why people get sick. Why do they age? Why do they die so young? And I've never known a person who died too old. They always died too young. Why did this happen? So I've always had that curiosity, but it doesn't exist in everybody. So our church We need to instill that obligation in the public and in our membership in a way that we all share the common goal of humanity to establish and accelerate the development of technologies that are going to enable us to move into that environment of perpetual duration. And number 5, and this is where it really comes down to our church's fundamental mission of education. Mankind will act rationally when enough of society acknowledges it is possible and therefore obligatory to redirect energies now squandered on wars and relentless bickering, change that way of thinking towards the act of universal salvation. So again, analogies. We have to bring those to being. And these analogies aren't historic. These are going on right now. These are examples of man doing what he should not do. These are examples of mankind failing to feel he has an obligation to save his fellow man and even himself from needless death. And people are dying needlessly of cancer all the time when existing therapies have been proven to be effective. And we're going to talk right now about one overlooked drug, just one right now, that has resulted in millions of people needlessly dying. Now, aspirin long ago was shown to prevent heart attack. It took decades for the medical establishment to recognize that. And aspirin, by the way, has interesting anti-cancer effects to it. But a drug that has possibly even more profound anti-cancer effects is cimetidine. Cimetidine is the generic name for a drug that you probably have all heard of called Tagamet. It's taken to relieve heartburn. But a side effect of cimetidine when given to cancer patients is that it boosts immune function in a particular way that's extremely beneficial to cancer patients. What it does is it turns up the expression of their T helper cells and downregulates their T suppressor cells. What cancer cells do, it's really unique. They know that the immune system is kind of hostile to them, and they reprogram our immune system to turn off the ability to recognize and eradicate cancer cells. Cimetidine offsets that impact of cancer. Cimetidine also blocks the ability of metastatic cancer cells to adhere to the linings of the capillaries where they develop metastatic colonies. And it also inhibits angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels that grow into tumors. Now, the documentation on cimetidine is overwhelming. And anyone who wants to go home tonight and log on to PubMed, that's the National Library of Medicine's database that comprises of virtually all the published papers around the world, you type in cimetidine and cancer, and you'll read hundreds of studies that validate its efficacy in human clinical studies, in animal studies, under the microscope. The drug has been documented, and we've been talking about it since 1985. And here we are in 2013, and it's not being prescribed to cancer patients. And this is just absolutely sinful. This is an indication of sloth. It's an indication of discord in the conventional medical community, where studies can come out validating the efficacy of cimetidine, and the oncologists don't pay attention to it. They'll allow their patients to needlessly die. And that's something that's unacceptable to me. It's unacceptable to this church. And we're going to preach the fact that scientific rationality isn't existing at this time in the conventional medical establishment. We need to educate. We need to get the word out that there is an obligation to utilize proven technologies when a human being is struck with a difficult-to-treat disease. How effective is cimetidine? Well, colon cancer, when it strikes, it doesn't kill people because their colons die. It metastasizes to the liver, the lungs, the brain. It's the metastasis of those colon cancer cells that causes the death of about 55,000 Americans every year. Study done in 1994, this was long after cimetidine was shown to be effective. They gave cimetidine 5 days before the surgery to remove the primary tumor from the colon, and then they administered it a couple days after the surgery. And then they followed these people over a period of time. And remarkably, the people who got the cimetidine, they were much more likely to be alive than the group not getting the cimetidine. People not getting the cimetidine They died at a very high rate. In fact, they died 6 or 7 times more than the people getting the cimetidine. We have here over a 3-year period that the people getting the cimetidine had a much greater survival rate. And 41% of the people not getting cimetidine died, compared to only 7%. I mean, to me, this is a crime that this knowledge has not been more widely disseminated. That cancer patients are going in for surgery, and this cheap, generic drug is not being recommended to them. It's not being prescribed to them by their physicians. This is a more recent study where they gave cimetidine to a group of colon cancer patients, and after 10 years, you had 84% of them still alive, compared to about 49% of the patients not giving the cimetidine. I mean, these are medical breakthroughs, and they don't make it in the media. They get into the medical journals, but they're overlooked and ignored by the medical establishment. I mean, this is the kind of information that has to be disseminated, and it's an example of what Fedorov talked about, that man is not doing what he should be doing. There is no reason for this drug not to be administered to virtually every single cancer patient. And if you do go to PubMed tonight and you see all the different types of cancer this drug has been shown to be effective for, you're going to wonder why. Well, unfortunately, it's the sloth. It's the discord, where maybe one progressive oncologist in a group says, why don't we prescribe cimetidine? And 4 other oncologists in that group say, well, it's not approved. Not approved by the government, so we're not going to do it. We're just going to let our patients die rather than prescribing this safe and effective therapy. One study used a dose of the 800 milligrams every single night. That worked well, but it's more effectively utilized if it's given prior to surgery. Reason being, when surgery is done on a colon cancer patient or any kind of cancer patient, metastatic cells are released into the bloodstream. And that release of those cells into the bloodstream is what enables those metastatic cancer colonies to form. And if you put cimetidine into a patient ahead of time, you reduce the ability of those metastatic cells to adhere to the capillary beds where they form metastatic tumors. And what we have happen is colon cancer patients will ask us about, what should we do now that we've had our surgery? Well, we get them on cimetidine, but they may have already had those metastatic colonies form. And it just doesn't work as well after the operation as it does before the operation. The fact that we're here in 2013, and I'm bringing this type of information out, is absurd. Again, 1985, there was enough data for virtually every cancer patient to consider cimetidine. Wasn't proven, but it was non-toxic, it was readily available, and here we are in 2013, and I have yet to hear of a cancer patient, and I talked to a lot of them, who's had an oncologist recommend cimetidine. And bear in mind, you can buy this at Walmart, Walgreens, CVS, Publix. It's over the counter. This is not expensive. It's not something that's unproven, and yet the oncology community has ignored it. 55,000 Americans dead every single year from a disease that we could probably prevent at least 80 or 90% of them from perishing it. So just bringing out this one piece of information, this single piece of information, I'm hoping everyone in the group will have an opportunity to utilize it. Hopefully not for themselves, but maybe for someone they care for. Again, it's 55,000 Americans who die from colon cancer. You get about 180,000 every year who are diagnosed with it. So you're going to know people who are going to tell you, they're going to send you an email, I've just been diagnosed with colon cancer. And because you've been here tonight, you might remember, hey, there's this drug. And we'll have this up on our website. You can always just go to the Church of Perpetual Life website and see it. You say, hey, you know, if you take this drug before surgery, you're going to improve your rate of survival significantly. So why not take this drug? It's not expensive, it's readily available, it's not side effect laden. People sometimes question me, if it's that good, well, how could it be overlooked? I mean, something that dramatic. Well, unfortunately, pharmaceutical control over our academia, the media, the FDA, it suppresses this information. It causes the promotion of cancer drugs that can sometimes cost over $100,000 a year. Those are the drugs that are promoted to the oncologists. And the ones that cost virtually nothing, that are far more effective than some of these $100,000 a year drugs, this information is suppressed. Our church has been established to teach scientific rationality. And rationality would look at cimetidine on a colon cancer patient and say, wow, look at that data. Look at how many more people survive with cimetidine compared to a drug that costs about $80,000, but you don't have to worry about paying for it every year because it only extends survival by a couple months. The drug I'm talking about is Avastin. That's one of those angiogenesis inhibitors that they thought was going to work, didn't work. It's very toxic, and it gives people a couple more months of miserable existence. That can cost you $80,000 to $90,000. But don't worry about the next year, you probably won't be around. Cimetidine, you can take that for about a year after surgery. After that, it doesn't seem like you need it anymore. So our objective here is to enlighten our members about validated approaches to disease prevention, disease treatment, ways to slow and reverse aging that are not making it into the mainstream. And we hope as this congregation grows, this information will get out in a way that we will feel obligated to make sure that if we hear of somebody who has a medical problem and we know of something that could help them, we're going to disseminate that information because it's our duty. It's our obligation to our fellow man. The next analogy we're going to talk about is a drug that is pertinent to everyone in this room. This is a drug that can prevent cancer. It can prevent dementia. It can prevent cardiovascular disease. It may slow aging. And most people don't take this drug because it's only been approved to treat type 2 diabetes. In 2012, metformin made headline news. If you happen to be watching the news that day, they talked about this anti-diabetic drug that was effective in preventing and treating cancer. And yet, one day it was up and the next day it was gone. And I've yet to meet a person outside of our community that takes metformin for cancer prevention. I've been taking metformin now for about 11 years. A nice side benefit to it, by the way, which you'll see in some of these presentations, is it helps you lose some weight, lose 7 to 10 pounds, around the midsection in particular. So it's got a benefit in that respect, so it's worth taking for that reason alone for a lot of people. Metformin is currently the first drug of choice in treating type 2 diabetes. It's relatively safe. It works partially for diabetics. It's not completely as effective for diabetics as we'd like it to be. It actually works much better in healthy people. But it was approved in England in 1958. Approved for use in England, it spread throughout Europe. Canada approved it in 1972. American diabetics, they didn't have it. They couldn't legally obtain metformin until the end of 1994. And then that meant the drug wasn't really available until 1995. So American type 2 diabetics were perishing when an effective drug existed to slash their risk of heart disease and cancer and stroke and kidney failure. Our people in this country were dying merely because an effective drug wasn't allowed in this country. Again, getting back to Fedorov, man doing what he should not do. Metformin should not have been suppressed. That hold up in metformin, and you're going to learn more and more about metformin as the years go by. This will become accepted doctrine. This is an indictment of a failed system that will forever cause needless suffering and death unless it's substantially changed. And if we're not going to do it, if we're not going to get together and make a group effort to change it, I hate to say it, it's going to be slow, painful, and agonizing. Man will cease doing what he should not do only when he knows what to do. Education, teaching scientific rationality, the purpose of the Church of Perpetual Life. We knew about these anti-cancer effects of metformin because the data was available long before 2012. It took a major study that you're going to see in a few minutes to make the information so profound that CNN and CBS and NBC decided, well, let's make a news story out of this. An anti-diabetic drug, effective against cancer. They made it a news story. But it was long ago known that metformin had these properties. The reason that drugs like metformin and drugs like low-dose aspirin and drugs like cimetidine aren't promoted to doctors, the reason you don't see them advertised on TV like you do Cialis and Viagra and all these anti-arthritic medications is that it is illegal for the manufacturers of metformin. And metformin is now a generic drug. But it is illegal for those manufacturers to promote metformin as a cancer preventative. It's illegal to promote it as a cancer treatment. It's illegal to promote it as an effective adjuvant therapy for obesity. You can't do it. So you have to come to a place like this if you're going to learn about metformin and other drugs, because you're not going to see it on your TV or your computer screen unless you go looking for it. It's not going to be promoted because it's illegal. If man does not know what to do, he will do what he should not do. Our government has made it illegal to promote safe and effective drugs. Some of these drugs are freely sold over the counter in other countries, and we're not allowed to hear about them. We're not allowed to buy them. We're not allowed to use them. We're doing what we should not do. And we have to instill again in society that these traits, these flaws in humanity, they have to be abolished. Now, type 2 diabetics, they suffer outrageous levels of diseases. Heart attack, of course, is what's most commonly associated with diabetes. Heart attack, stroke, kidney failure. But they also suffer astounding rates of pancreatic cancer, which kills virtually every person who contracts it. And metformin has been shown to not only reduce all these markers of disease, but it slashes pancreatic cancer risk. And what I want to describe right now is why metformin is something you want to take right now. As we get older, our glucose levels increase, and that doesn't do us any good. The reason our glucose levels are so dominant in our bodies now is they were needed for survival. If glucose drops below 50 milligrams per deciliter of blood, we'll often lose consciousness and we'll often die if they get down too low. So our body has developed mechanisms to synthesize glucose. So in the event we're unable to get our hands on a carbohydrate, and if you can imagine primitive man, in the wintertime there were no carbohydrates, and when they went and killed a saber-toothed tiger, they get their hands on protein and fat, but they didn't have any carbohydrates to eat, and they needed to maintain their glucose levels. So what our bodies evolved into was an ability to take protein and convert it into glucose in our liver. Now, that was wonderful when we didn't have access to carbohydrates, but in modern society, we've got access to lots of carbs, and as we get older, our livers start to produce too much glucose. The typical diabetic, typical type 2 diabetic, produces 3 times more glucose than what they should be. And even if they try to eat well and do everything perfectly, their livers continue to churn out too much glucose. Metformin reduces the rate at which our liver stores and produces excess glucose. The medical term for this is gluconeogenesis. It's the formation of glucose in the liver from proteins, sometimes fats. And metformin reduces the rate of gluconeogenesis, anywhere between 24 and 36%. It reduces glucose levels and also lowers excess insulin. This all helps people lose some weight. It's not going to make them thin if they're significantly overweight, but it's one of those pillars of a successful weight loss program that can be of benefit. Metformin enhances insulin sensitivity. It enables glucose to be removed more efficiently from the blood. So not only does it suppress the excess formation of glucose in our liver, but it enables the glucose in our bloodstream to be more effectively utilized. And metformin has been shown to dramatically reduce both glucose and insulin levels. And I mention insulin because we view excess insulin as a death hormone. A hormone that accelerates aging, accelerates disease processes, and cancer cells love it. Insulin just enables cancer cells to propagate much more rapidly than in the presence of low insulin. Now, we know all these damaging effects of insulin, and yet what are doctors doing today? They are prescribing insulin injections to type 2 diabetics. And medical journals now are running advertisements from drug companies, and they're trying to remind doctors that insulin is still around. That, have we forgotten about insulin, these advertisements read? Because, of course, if you take a type 2 diabetic and they inject insulin, their glucose levels drop. And you get an immediate gratification there. Hey, we lowered your glucose levels. But we did that by giving you insulin. which increases your risk of cancer and blindness and heart disease and a whole lot of other problems. We've given you something maybe not as bad as glucose, but almost as bad. Drug companies are promoting therapies to type 2 diabetics that don't make sense. These therapies either cause the pancreas to secrete excess levels of insulin. This is not the way to treat type 2 diabetes. So again, getting back to Fedorov, if man does not know what to do, he will do what he should not do. Most doctors today do not know how to adequately treat advanced cases of type 2 diabetes. They may be treating the earlier stages a little more effectively than they were 5 or 10 years ago, but the advanced stage cases are getting these sulfonylurea drugs which stimulate insulin production in the pancreas. That temporarily lowers glucose, as I said, but it comes at a very high price. You're walking around with chronically elevated insulin levels, hyperinsulinemia, a deadly, deadly complication. So the harsh reality today, if you have a family member, a friend, someone you care for, they're type 2 diabetic, and their doctors are prescribing them insulin. They gain weight. People who are prescribed either the drugs that produce insulin in the pancreas or given insulin injections, they put on weight, and their rate of cancer skyrockets. So again, going back to Fedorov, if man does not know what to do, he will do what he should not do. And today we're prescribing drugs to people that are shortening their lifespan. It's causing someone who's overweight to put more weight on, and it's accelerating their disease process. You know, metformin was around for a much longer time than 1958. They actually knew about this in the early 1900s. And what happened is when insulin came around, they thought, well, we don't need metformin anymore. We just give people insulin. And that way we can treat their type 2 diabetes. And that was an ill-conceived way of doing things. Sulfonylurea drugs are still liberally prescribed because they provide immediate gratification. A person showing up at a doctor's office at a glucose level of 160 milligrams per deciliter, and the doctor says, well, just take this pill. A couple days later, they're down to 100. And they think, well, miracles occurred. But that miracle, unfortunately, is going to create havoc in their body. Sulfonylurea drugs, they cause weight gain. They create all kind of havoc in the body. There's even a warning on the labels of these drugs. They're going to increase your risk of heart disease. And here you are, a type 2 diabetic, and your big concern is heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, and your doctor is prescribing you a drug in which the warning label says you're going to increase your risk of these disorders by taking this drug. It's going to temporarily lower your glucose levels. There was a study done over 10 years, and it showed significant reductions in heart attack risk and death from any cause. And the same study showed that people weren't gaining weight on metformin compared to the sulfonylurea drugs, which do put weight on people. And let me just relate something that's not on the slides. A study came out this week. It showed that diabetics taking metformin, as expected, had significantly lower rates of heart attack. But a group of people who did not have diabetes, they didn't see the same benefits. And there's a reason for that. Metformin is something that inhibits the absorption of vitamin B12. So if you're going to take metformin, take your B12 at a separate time of the day. Because when you don't have enough vitamin B12 in your body, your homocysteine levels are going to increase. And when homocysteine increases, your risk of vascular disease goes up. So if a healthy person were to take just metformin and nothing else, they might develop a B12 deficiency. Their homocysteine might elevate it. And all they have to do is make sure they take their B12 at a separate time of the day. Another effect of metformin in some men is it lowers their testosterone levels. And men with lower testosterone levels can have a higher rate of heart attack. So if you take metformin and you get a blood test and you see your testosterone levels aren't where they need to be, go to a doctor, have them prescribe you some topical testosterone cream and get them up to where they should be. So you give yourself kind of a holistic approach to both aging, disease prevention, and keeping excess body weight off. The dark age of medicine, when it comes to diabetes, we certainly have documented that so far tonight. Doctors prescribing drugs to boost insulin instead of boosting insulin sensitivity. People will not take something often unless they know how it works. And I don't expect everyone in this room to understand some of what I'm going to talk about today, but if you at least understand there are mechanisms of action that enable metformin to not only lower blood sugar and lower insulin, but also prevent cancer. We've already talked about metformin's ability to inhibit gluconeogenesis. Metformin also enhances insulin sensitivity, so glucose can exit the blood and go into the cells where it can produce its energy-enhancing effect. Metformin, by the way, also limits some of the absorption of carbohydrates that you're eating, which is why you should always take metformin before a meal. But something that people don't always know about is an enzyme called adenosine monophosphate protein kinase. AMPK, that's the acronym for that adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase. This enzyme has a profound effect in both the prevention and treatment of cancer. Cancer cells don't like this enzyme. It speeds their metabolism and causes them to undergo apoptosis. It causes them to self-destruct. So metformin has a value in cancer treatment in addition to cancer prevention, and there are some large-scale studies going on with prostate and other cancers where metformin is being incorporated in the treatment regimen to verify that it does really effectively reduce the death of cancer. Now, this was a study that made the headline news. It came out of the MD Anderson Clinic, and anything comes out of MD Anderson, of course, that has media credibility. The media believes it. But they looked at a group of diabetics who had been taking metformin, and their risk of pancreatic cancer went down by 62%. I mean, this is huge. When you realize 30,000 Americans every single year are dying of pancreatic cancer, and a primary underlying culprit that causes it is elevated glucose and insulin. Type 2 diabetics, unfortunately, they have these sharply higher rates, and if they were to only have taken metformin, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who would be alive right now. And they're dead just because this drug was suppressed. Metformin is a low-cost generic. There's no economic reason why everyone should not be on it unless they have some contraindications. And that's why you need to go to a doctor and make sure that you're safely able to take the metformin. But what we have to do is convince people that this is something that they should be taking. And we do this with people we care for. If people we care for, we see they're putting on too much weight, their sugar levels are getting high, and they're just getting older, so their cancer rates are going up, we should tell them, you know, there's this drug out there, and you don't have to believe me, just go to the computer. We've got a medical library right now in our own homes, type in metformin and cancer, and after you read about it, I think you're going to want to say, let's go to your doctor and ask for a metformin prescription. As far as the people that we recommend take metformin, if your fasting glucose is over 85 milligrams per deciliter, we think you should be taking it because anything over 85 increases your risk of a heart attack. It's going to increase your risk of cancer. So you get this immediate benefit with metformin of lowering glucose levels that are higher than optimal. Now, nowadays doctors recognize glucose over 99 as being in a danger level. But if you look at all the published literature, you may come to a conclusion that glucose levels over 85 is not where you want to be. And metformin can help you suppress those. Suggested starting dose of metformin, 250 milligrams before a large meal. You can increase that to 2 meals a day. You can go up to 500 milligrams after 3 or 4 weeks and eventually get up to an upper dose limit, which is about 850 milligrams before meals. I take, personally, 850 milligrams of metformin before at least 2 meals of the day, sometimes 3. I've been doing that now for about 11 years. It's taken a nice amount of fat off my belly. Has enabled me to lose a lot of weight. People sometimes see me after a while and they say I look ill. No, really, I'm quite healthy. What I've done is I've shed excess fat pounds, and metformin, topical testosterone, and just frankly reducing some of the calories that I eat. That has helped me lose weight. And that's one of the other side benefits of metformin is that it'll reduce your appetite just a little bit. And if you happen to start taking metformin and you realize, I'm not as hungry anymore, I don't need to finish everything that's on that big plate of food of mine, well, take advantage of that. Just don't eat that food. In other words, start to practice a little bit of calorie restriction because you won't be hungry anymore. The metformin will help reduce your appetite. And it does that by stabilizing your sugar and insulin levels so you don't have those gyrations of glucose spikes, then insulin spikes to lower the glucose, and vice versa. We don't promote anything commercially here at this church, by the way. Again, metformin, cimetidine, aspirin, these are generic drugs. You can buy them anywhere. We called around recently to the local pharmacies, and the price is all around about the same for a generic. A 30-day supply of metformin, $6.50. $6.50 for a 30-day supply of a drug that reduces your risk of virtually every degenerative disease that we're faced with today. And you might lose some weight. You go to a health food store sometimes and buy an expensive bottle of amphetamine-laced pills. They'll charge you $60, $70 for that bottle. You may only take it for a few weeks. You'll be shaking so badly from the amphetamines you won't want to take them anymore. The amphetamines may also kill you. They don't give you any health benefit. Here, this drug might let you lose a little bit of weight and then prevent your risk of cancer. The 37-year delay in approving metformin, that alone provides a real-world example of how broken our regulatory systems are when it comes to finding cures for degenerative disease and the aging process itself. We've got to change the regulatory system so that we can bring novel technologies to the forefront, not 10 years after they're discovered or 40 years after they're discovered. They need to be brought forth immediately, especially to terminally ill people. There's no reason for these people to be denied something experimental if they're willing to sign a waiver saying, do whatever you can. I've got 3 weeks to live, nothing to lose here. Again, these are some references to validate everything I said about metformin. We're just going through these in case we put this on the internet. We want people to be able to see that there's scientific substantiation behind every single thing we say. So going back to our prophet, Nikolai Fedorov, his 5 doctrines. He talks about the sins that we are committing through sloth and discord. And that discord exists in the medical community as much as it does anywhere else. I happen to know a lot of people in the medical community, so I understand how much infighting there is, where something very logical was brought before a group of doctors, and they sit there and argue. Instead of saying, well, this makes sense, let's do it, they're there arguing. And sometimes that's because they have economic incentives to suppress an effective therapy. So the doctors who see that their drug is going to be taken off because a better drug's going to come on, they argue against the better drug. But again, to go over these doctrines of Fedorov, and these doctrines apply as much today as they did when he wrote them. If man does not know what to do, he will do what he should not do. Cimetidine, metformin, aspirin, effective medications that were suppressed for decades and continue to be suppressed. Man will cease doing what he should not do only when he knows what to do. Our church is dedicated to educating the public about scientific rationality. Get rid of the economics. Get rid of the prejudice. We're talking about rational behavior, rational thought. And anyone who would sit through this presentation, who was about to undergo colon cancer surgery and say, oh, I'm not going to take cimetidine, I'm not going to bother with metformin or aspirin. All 3 of those drugs, by the way, should be given to most cancer patients. They all have specific anti-cancer properties that can amplify the effects of whatever traditional therapies or conventional therapies you're going to be using. Man will give his energies to a cause when he regards it as his duty. And you look at the effort that people put out for causes right now. There was a terrible typhoon in the Philippines, and you've got people who feel it's their duty to go over there and help. It's their duty to contribute money to help those people. You've got hundreds of thousands of people around the world who are helping some people who legitimately need some assistance. But we don't feel that sense of duty or obligation when it comes to preserving our own lives and the lives of those who we care for. So Fedorov's 5th doctrine, mankind will act rationally when enough of society acknowledges it is possible and therefore obligatory to redirect the energies now squandered on wars and relentless bickering. Take those energies and put them towards the act of universal salvation. The common goal of humanity is what was espoused by Nikolai Fedorov, and I wholeheartedly endorse it, as do the founders of this church. Our critics contend that we're not going to be able to control aging. But I think I've documented so far the fact that diseases that we thought could never be contained, never be controlled, they didn't even know what caused them, they've been eradicated. They're gone. They're no longer a problem. So as we have to deal with our skeptics, we have to remind them historically, everyone was pessimistic. Everyone thought life would just be an average age of 36 or 47. No one imagined that average lifespans would go to where they are today. And certainly people today don't understand what's going to happen. But if you understand the scientific discoveries that have occurred in recent years, it would appear aging is going to be reversible before this century ends. But that's not fast enough. We need to accelerate that pace, and we're already on the road to doing that in many respects. So our duty here is to advance the common goal of humanity. This affects everybody. Everyone's aging. Everyone's got some disorder they're having a problem dealing with. And we're all facing involuntary death. So this is not just helping a group of people who legitimately need it in a part of the world. This is affecting everyone in the world. I'm going to conclude this with a little description, just a very brief description of Lee von Hoek. He had a curiosity about microscopic organisms. He's the one who discovered them. He liked to play with lenses, and he would put lenses together and be able to look at smaller and smaller microorganisms. And he felt an obligation to not only make these observations, but to have drawings made of what he discovered under the microscope and share that information with scientific communities. And these scientific communities at the time, they looked forward to seeing his drawings because no one else in the world was doing it. And what Lee von Hoek wrote in a letter, it had a significant impact on me. And you look at that year, 1716. No one knew anything about microorganisms. No one even conceived that these were what was causing the illnesses of the day. The viruses, the bacteria, the parasites. No one even thought that this was an issue. But here was a researcher curious enough to identify them, to draw them, to at least let people who were interested know that they existed. But because before he played around with his lenses and created his microscopes, no one knew these existed. But I want to read a portion of a letter that he wrote, because this has had a significant impact on me, because it relates to people I know. It relates to people I know in this room. It relates to people I've met throughout my entire lifetime. These are different people. These are not the typical person who just goes through life and feels like they have minimal obligations to society, if any at all. But Lee von Hoek stated, "My work, which I've done for a long time, was not pursued in order to gain the praise I now enjoy, but chiefly from a craving after knowledge, which I notice resides in me more than most other men. And therewithal, whenever I found out anything remarkable, I have thought it my duty to put down my discovery on paper, so that all ingenious people might be informed thereof." It resulted in doctors hundreds of years later coming to a conclusion that microorganisms were the leading cause of death. And if you killed these microorganisms, if you immunized against these microorganisms, you'd eradicate the leading causes of death of the day. I promised you at the beginning of this presentation, you were going to see something that's never been shown before. We're going to just hold this slide here just to remind you. A 45-year-old woman, who, by the way, is a very healthy woman now because of the therapy she underwent. She had significant hypoperfusion, hypometabolic activity. Those two little holes right there at the top of her brain. This huge area of low metabolic activity. Virtually nothing going on. Bear in mind, her brain structure was there. It's just, it wasn't all functioning. These deep caverns, this huge gulf, indicating, this was done by a SPECT scan. The SPECT scan measures metabolic activity, not structure. You look at that. Within 60 days of initiating a therapy, using a drug, by the way, that was approved in 1991, this is her brain. Remember those two little holes at the very top? They're filled in. Remember how deep that cavern was at the very top of her skull? A lot of that activity has been restored. Even more remarkable, we go to the base of her brain. Those two caverns that seem to descend all the way through her brain, they're mostly filled in. And look at how much restoration of metabolic activity occurred. Look at this. Maybe we should go back just to remind people how bad off this woman was. She was crippled with chronic fatigue syndrome. And she had a lot of other biomarkers of accelerated aging, lots of inflammation, lipid levels out of balance, glucose levels out of balance. She was aging at an accelerated rate. And she was, as I said, a disabled individual, which led her to engage in this experimental therapy. Look at that. 60 days, within 60 days, we have this kind of an improvement. Now, everyone in this room, I hate to say it, has some of that hypometabolic activity occurring in their brain. I say everybody, well, there's some young people that don't. You see, but when we get older, and when we maybe consume too much ethanol, maybe some recreational drugs, eating the wrong kind of foods, eat a lot of saturated fats, it tends to clog the capillaries in your brain. We develop these hypometabolic regions of our brain, and they impair our cognitive function, and they lead to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and stroke. Well, there's now a therapy that we are investigating that may enable us to reverse that process. And this is a breakthrough that no one knows exists except the people in this room right now, and a few others. And we hope through this church and other organizations to accelerate the development of this technology so we can take aging people who have systemic degenerative problems, because it's not just in the brain, it's systemic improvements that we're seeing in patients who are undergoing this therapy. We can reverse the aging process. Do something that no one believes can occur today. Well, it's already occurred. It's already happened. So to conclude, our creed, at least for this first service, is our mission. The common goal of humanity is to accelerate the development of technologies that will enable mankind to evolve into an environment of perpetual duration, of perpetual life, or at least indefinitely extended life, free of the illnesses, the diseases, the disabilities that aging inflicts on us. I want to again thank everyone for showing up tonight. We could have, I think, packed this room. We intentionally didn't for a number of reasons. We wanted to see what kind of organic attendance that we could gain. This was not advertised anywhere. It was not promoted to the media. This is our first service. We plan to have our next service December 24th. That's going to be an annual event where we try to remember people who have not made it, who have not reached the stage that we have. We're going to run some of their names, review some of their biographies, and talk about ways that we may be able to revive these individuals. So that's going to be our December 24th service. Some of you may have something else to do December 24th, and that's fine. This is a non-denominational organization. We're going to have holidays throughout the year at unusual times and usual times. But it's going to be a time for us to gather together. And downstairs, we've got some refreshments. And after the service, I'm going to be here. I look forward to talking to everyone about any topic they'd like. Anything that's non-commercial, that, by the way, nothing commercial. This church, our mission is to accelerate the common goal of humanity, and commercial activities can occur outside the church. I want to thank you all.